When humans walked into the Galactic Council, silence fell. The signal came at 3:47 in the morning, and it did not ask permission. Commander Yara Voss was standing in the control room of the Deep Space Listening Array outside Nairobi when the alarm cut through the quiet like a blade. She had been awake for 22 hours already. She had a cold cup of coffee in her hand and a stack of unread reports on the desk behind her, and she was staring at a screen that showed nothing but static when, suddenly, it did not show static anymore. It showed a message. Not a random pulse, not a natural radio burst from a dying star. A message, structured, layered, encoded in mathematics so clean and deliberate that the lead analyst, a sharp young man named Oliver Crane, looked at his screen, looked at Yara, and said in a very quiet voice, "Someone built this." Yara set down her coffee. "Play it." The sound that came through the speakers was nothing like music and nothing like speech. It was a series of tonal patterns, rising and falling in sequences that felt almost familiar, the way a word in a language you have never studied can sometimes feel like it is almost on the tip of your tongue. It lasted 4 minutes and 31 seconds. When it ended, the control room was completely silent. Then Oliver said, "It came from outside the heliosphere." No one moved for a long time. Yara was 38 years old. She had spent 14 years in the undiplomatic corps, had worked through 2 first-contact preparedness protocols, had survived something that no briefing document quite covered, an encounter on Kepler 452b with a life form that was not intelligent in any way humans recognized, but was certainly alive and certainly aware, and had made very clear that it did not want Yara near its nest. She had walked away from that with a scar along her left forearm, and a deep, permanent understanding that the universe was not arranged for human comfort. She looked at the message on the screen and felt something she had not expected to feel, not fear, not excitement. Recognition. "Get the director," she said, "get everyone." It took 11 years to decode the message fully. 11 years of the finest mathematical minds on Earth working in rotating shifts across 6 continents, cross-referencing every known pattern in physics, biology, chemistry, and pure logic. 11 years during which the existence of the message was the most closely guarded secret in human history, shared by fewer than 400 people, not one of whom ever leaked it, because not one of them could quite believe it was real. What the message said, when it was finally understood, was this. The Galactic Council of 17 recognized civilizations extended an observation invitation to the sentient inhabitants of the Sol system. Attendance was voluntary. The location, a deep space station called the Nexus Eternal, was provided in coordinates precise enough to follow. The date was set 31 years from the message's arrival, and at the very bottom, written in the same clean mathematical language as the rest, was a clause so casual it could have been mistaken for a footnote. The attending species acknowledges it holds no claim to council protections, resources, or recognition. Not a welcome, an observation invite, the kind extended to things worth watching, not things worth knowing. Yara read that clause 4 times. Then she folded the decoded transcript, put it in a secure case, and carried it to the Unsecurity Council, where she read it aloud in a room full of the most powerful people on Earth. When she finished, the room was so quiet she could hear the building's ventilation system humming. The debate that followed lasted 3 years. Some argued it was a trap. Some argued it was a test. Some argued humanity was not ready, that the species which had spent 10,000 years struggling to cooperate with itself should not march into a chamber full of alien civilizations and expect to be taken seriously. Some argued that going was an act of reckless confidence that could endanger the entire planet. An elderly astrophysicist named Dr. Constance Obi, who was 94 years old and had spent 60 years studying signals from deep space, sat through 37 hours of debate. Then she raised her hand, waited to be recognized, and said 7 words into the microphone. "We have always walked into such rooms." The vote passed by a margin of 3. Yara was chosen as humanity's sole delegate not because she was the most decorated diplomat on Earth, though she was decorated. Not because she spoke the most languages, though she spoke 9. She was chosen because she was the only person alive who had encountered something genuinely alien and had responded not by following protocol, but by sitting very still, making no sudden movements, and waiting until the creature decided on its own that she was not a threat. "You have a particular quality," the selection committee chair told her. "You do not panic." "I do panic," Yara said. "I just do it quietly on the inside where it does not cause problems." The chair did not find that funny. Yara did not particularly care. The ship they gave her was called the HFY. It was the finest long-range vessel humanity had ever built. It had a crew of 41, all of them the best at what they did. It had shielding and sensors and a medical bay and a library and a gymnasium and 17 different backup power systems, because the engineers who built it understood that Yara was going somewhere no human had ever gone, and they wanted, very badly, for her to come back. In the cargo hold, packed alongside supplies and equipment, were 12 terabytes of human data. History, art, music, literature, discoveries and mistakes. The things humanity had built and the things humanity had destroyed, and the long, complicated, occasionally terrible story of how a species that started with nothing but curiosity and stubbornness had clawed its way from mud huts to the edge of the stars. Yara's briefing officer, a meticulous man named Lieutenant George Hartwell, told her on the morning of departure that the average lifespan of a new species at the Galactic Council was 2 sessions before they were classified, filed, and forgotten. Yara nodded. "And after that?" "After that," George said carefully, "they tend not to receive further invitations." She looked at him for a moment. He was trying to prepare her. She appreciated that. "George," she said, "we are the species that spent 400 years trying to fly and finally did it in a field in North Carolina with a machine made of wood and fabric. We have been almost forgotten before." She turned and walked up the boarding ramp. 41 crew members followed her. The doors closed. The HFY left Earth on a Tuesday morning, lifting through a pale blue sky that Yara watched from the bridge window until it became black and full of stars. She did not cry. She was not the type, but she pressed one hand flat against the cold glass and held it there for a long moment, and she did not move it until the Earth was too small to see. The Nexus Eternal did not look like anything Yara had imagined, and she had imagined quite a lot. She had studied every piece of conceptual artwork humanity had ever produced about alien space stations. She had read the theoretical papers and the speculative fiction and the architectural projections. She thought she was prepared. She was not prepared. The station was the size of a moon, not like a moon, the size of one. It hung in the dark between star systems with the complete, unhurried certainty of something that had been there for a very long time and expected to remain there for much longer. Its surface was not uniform. It had sections that appeared organic, curving, and biological, next to sections that were rigid and geometric, next to sections that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves on a timescale too slow to track directly but too obvious to ignore. It had lights, though calling them lights felt inadequate. They pulsed in colors that had no names in any human language. Yara stood on the bridge of the HFY and looked at it through the forward viewport for 1 full minute before she spoke. "It generates its own weather systems," said Lieutenant Commander Penny Hartley, reading from the sensor array. Her voice was impressively steady, which Yara noted and appreciated. "I can see that," Yara said. There were clouds moving across the lower hemisphere of the station. Actual clouds. How large is the docking section?" "Larger than London." "All right," Yara straightened her jacket, "take us in." The docking corridor assigned to them was located in a section of the station that, according to the guidance signal they received, was designated for non-member observers. It took 20 minutes to navigate. In those 20 minutes, Yara counted 7 other ships in adjacent corridors. She could not identify the design language of any of them. They were not built by anything with human hands, or anything with hands at all, in at least 2 cases. The moment the docking clamps locked and the umbilical connected, Yara got her first indication of what the next several days would hold. No one came to meet them. There was no welcoming party, no representative, no communication of any kind. The station's automated guidance system provided a route to the observer processing area. That was all. George, who had come along as her support officer, checked the protocol manual 3 times. "It appears," he said, with a carefully neutral expression, "that observation delegates do not receive formal reception." "Meaning we let ourselves in," Yara said. "Yes, Commander." She picked up her case. "Fine, let's go." The observer processing area was managed by a system, not a creature. A system that processed Yara's documentation with mechanical efficiency and issued her an identity marker, a small translucent disc that attached to her collar and pulsed with a faint light she quickly learned meant unclassified observer, non-member species. She noticed that the processing system did not make eye contact with her. She then realized it had no eyes, and she was projecting human social expectations onto a machine, which was something she was going to need to stop doing immediately. George leaned close to her ear. "It assigned you seating location 7-sub-B. "What is sub-B?" He hesitated. "Below the main floor." They found seating location 7-sub-B after a 15-minute walk through corridors that were clearly not designed for human proportions, not hostile to them, simply indifferent. Yara was not tall, which helped. George was, and he spent the walk with his shoulders slightly hunched. The observer alcove was a transparent bubble attached to the underside of the main council chamber floor. It jutted down into open space like a fish tank bolted below a table. From inside it, Yara could look up through the transparent floor and see the chamber above, or look out through the curved walls into the cavernous void of the station's interior. She stood in it for a moment. She looked up at the chamber floor above her. She could see the undersides of the council seats. She was beneath them, literally, architecturally, deliberately beneath them. George said nothing. He was wise enough to know that nothing he said would be useful. Yara sat down. She opened her case. She set up her recording equipment with careful, methodical movements, because when she was angry, she found that careful, methodical movements kept the anger from doing anything unhelpful. She was angry. She allowed herself exactly 90 seconds of it, sitting in that bubble below the floor of the Galactic Council chamber, feeling the full weight of the deliberate architecture of dismissal around her. Then she was done being angry. On her second day on the station, moving through the lower observation corridors, she encountered a figure she had not expected. He was not human, but he was bipedal, which meant her eyes registered him as approximately person-shaped before her brain caught up with the differences. The secondary pair of arms folded at the lower torso, the pale gray skin that shifted slightly in certain lights, the large dark eyes that tracked movement with a precision that made her feel briefly like something being assessed. He stopped in front of her. "You are the human," he said. His translation device produced the words in accented but clear English, which startled her more than anything else so far. "I am," she said. "I am Thesson Vor. I represent the Keth civilization. I have served on this council for 200 of your years." He looked at her with an expression she could not read, but something in the stillness of it felt, unexpectedly, like concern. "I want to offer you advice." Yara waited. "Do not speak unless directly addressed. Do not allow your expressions to communicate what you are feeling. Do not react to anything you observe in the chamber, regardless of what it concerns. The council members will be watching you, even when they appear not to be. They are always watching new observers. They are cataloging your responses." What happens if I respond? Yara asked. It provides data. Data can be used. He paused. The Vreth are watching you with particular attention. I would be cautious. Who are the Vreth? He was quiet for a moment. A species of considerable influence and longer memory. They filed a preliminary brief on Solroman 6 days before your arrival. You should be aware of that. Yara felt something cold move through her chest. What kind of brief? A reclassification motion, Thessenvor said. They are seeking to have humanity designated as biologically persistent but cognitively non-contributory. She understood the words individually. Putting them together took one beat. They want to decide we are not worth considering. Before you have the opportunity to demonstrate otherwise, he said. Yes. He inclined his head once, which she would later learn was the Keth equivalent of a farewell, and walked away down the corridor, his secondary arms shifting slightly as he moved. Yara stood alone in the corridor for a long moment. Cognitively non-contributory. She thought about Constance Obi, 94 years old, raising one thin hand in a room full of powerful people, and speaking 7 words with complete certainty. She thought about every generation of humans who had been told, in one language or another, that they were not worth considering. She thought about what always happened next. The first council session began at a time that corresponded to the following morning. By the clock, Yara was still running. She climbed into her bubble below the floor and sat very still and watched through the transparent ceiling as 17 civilizations took their seats above her. When the session clerk called the roster, it moved through the 17-member races with efficient speed, each name producing a ripple of acknowledgement from the relevant seat. Then it reached the bottom of the list. Solroman 3, Observer Status, Unclassified. The chamber went quiet. Not the quiet of dismissal, not the quiet that follows something boring, the particular weighted quiet that falls when something unexpected has occurred. It lasted 4 seconds. Yara counted them. Every single eye in that chamber, and there were many of many kinds from many types of faces, turned downward and looked through the transparent floor into her bubble. She looked back. She did not flinch. She did not smile. She sat straight in her chair with her hands resting still on the desk in front of her, and she held their gaze, all of them, every last one, until they looked away first. The session continued. The 4 seconds ended and the clerk moved on, and the business of the Galactic Council resumed with its vast, practiced efficiency. But the 4 seconds had happened. They could not be undone. Yara wrote a single line in her personal log that night. She wrote, "They did not expect us to be here. Good." Below it in smaller letters she wrote, "The Vreth brief was filed 6 days before we arrived. They prepared for us. That is also good." She closed the log. She looked out through the curved walls of her bubble at the cold dark of the station interior, at the faraway lights moving through the deep space beyond. She was so far from home that the concept of distance had stopped feeling real. She was also exactly where she was supposed to be. The notification arrived through the station's administrative system at 6:14 in the morning, station time, and it landed on Yara's communication device with a soft chime that was entirely too pleasant for what it contained. The Vreth had filed a motion to fast-track the reclassification hearing. Standard deliberation timelines, typically 30 days, were being bypassed on grounds of procedural efficiency. The motion had already received preliminary support from 4 council members. The final vote on humanity's cognitive designation was now scheduled for 48 hours from that moment. Yara read the notification twice. Then she set the device down, face up on her desk, and stared at the ceiling of her bubble. 48 hours. George brought her coffee. Real coffee from the ISF Mara's supplies, because the station's food provision for observers was nutritionally adequate and completely devoid of anything resembling flavor. He set it in front of her and sat down across the desk and waited. "They're moving fast," he said. "They filed before we arrived," Yara said. "This was planned before they ever knew what I looked like or how I spoke or whether I was worth 2 minutes of consideration. They decided before I got here." She picked up the coffee and held it with both hands. "George, what do we have in the 12 terabytes?" He opened his data tablet. "Everything we loaded at departure, full archive." "I need the best of it, not the biggest or the most impressive. The best." She looked at him. "What does it mean to be human in under 6 minutes? What do you show?" George was quiet for a long time. He was not a man who spoke before he had thought carefully, which was one of the reasons she kept him close. "A child learning to walk," he said finally. "A rescue, something old." He paused. "Something that makes you feel small in a good way." She looked at him. "The pale blue dot," she said. "Yes," he said, "that." Thessenvor found her in the corridor outside the Observer Archive room, which was where she had been working for 6 consecutive hours, and he did not look pleased. "You filed a counterbrief," he said. "I did." "You cannot win this vote, Commander Voss. The Vreth have the numbers." "I am not trying to win the vote," Yara said. "I am trying to speak before it." He went still. "You found the address provision." Subclause 7 of the Observer Engagement Protocol. Any species filing a counterbrief has right of address before a vote that directly determines their classification status, regardless of observer rank. She looked at him steadily. "How old is that clause?" "It has not been invoked," Thessenvor said slowly, "in approximately 900 years." "Has it been removed?" He paused. "No." "Then it is still law." He looked at her for a long moment with those large, precisely tracking eyes. Then he said something that surprised her. "The Keth were given our designation 400 years ago, before we had contributed anything of measurable value to the Council. There was someone who argued for us then." He straightened slightly. "I did not expect to find the situation reversed." "You're not arguing for us," Yara said. "I am. You just told me the clause exists." Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle and she could not name it, but it was there. "You have 6 minutes," he said. "The Council will not extend your time under any circumstance." "6 minutes is enough," Yara said. "It has to be." The Council chamber above her was in full session when the address provision was submitted through the administrative system, and the reaction to it moved through the room like a current through water, not visible on the surface, but felt. She watched it from her bubble, watching the slight shifts in posture, the small exchanges between delegates, the moment when one of the Vreth representatives, a being whose form she could not fully process, all angles and restlessness, turned and looked directly down through the transparent floor at her with an attention that was not friendly. She met its gaze. She did not look away. The session clerk announced the address provision in a tone that suggested it was a minor procedural matter. The chamber acknowledged it in the same way. Yara was called to the address platform, not in the chamber above, she noted, but to a secondary platform accessible from the sublevel, which still projected her image and voice into the main space. Even in the act of letting her speak, the architecture reminded her of her place. She stepped onto the platform. 42 species representatives, filtering through by proxy or presence, oriented toward her in various ways that she could not fully read but could feel. She had 6 minutes. She did not begin with an argument. She pressed a key. On the display behind her, a video began to play. It was 12 seconds long. A human infant on a living room floor somewhere on Earth sometime in the past century. The child was trying to stand. It got 1 foot flat, pushed, rose about 6 inches and fell sideways. It looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then it rolled, got both hands down and tried again. The chamber watched in complete silence. The child fell 4 more times in those 12 seconds. On the 5th attempt, it stood. It stood for 3 full seconds, wavering, arms out for balance, face arranged in an expression of concentration so total it looked almost like distress. Then it sat down hard, on its padded lower half, and stared at the space where it had just been standing. The video ended. Yara did not explain it. She pressed another key. An audio recording, background noise of a mine site, voices in Spanish. Then an eruption of sound, shouting, cheering, crying, a chaos of relief so raw it barely sounded like celebration at all. A man's voice, rough and shaking, saying one word over and over in a language she did not translate for the council. They did not need the translation. The sound was the content. 69 days, Yara said, into the silence that followed. That man was underground for 69 days. His colleagues did not leave. His family did not leave. They built a machine they had never built before at a site they had never drilled to reach a depth that exceeded every prior attempt because they refused to accept that he was gone. She paused for one breath. "We do that," she said. "That is something we do." She pressed the third key. The pale blue dot filled the display. Carl Sagan's pale blue dot, Voyager 1, 1990, the photograph of Earth as a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam from 6 billion kilometers away. The chamber looked at it. Yara let them look for 5 full seconds before she spoke again. "That ship," she said, "is still moving. Right now, as I stand here, that ship is still moving away from that dot. It was launched by people who knew with complete certainty that they would never see where it went. They launched it anyway. They attached a golden record to its side, music, voices, mathematics, greetings in 55 languages, not because they expected anyone to find it, but because the act of reaching was itself worth doing." She looked out at the chamber. She could not read their faces, most of them. She spoke to the ones she could not read just as directly as the ones she could. "Every species in this chamber survived something," she said. "I do not know your histories in full, but I know that survival requires more than biology. It requires the decision, made over and over again in the face of every reason to stop, to continue. We have made that decision more times than I can count, and for longer than any living human can remember. We are not the oldest civilization in this room. We are not the most powerful. We have made terrible mistakes, some of which I carry in that 12-terabyte archive and would not hide from you if you asked. But we are here. We crossed the distance you set for us. We arrived at the place we were told we might not be worth entering." She let that sit for 2 seconds. "We did not come here to take anything," she said. "We came because when a door opens, we walk through it. That is who we are. That is what we have always been." She stepped back from the platform. The 6-minute marker had not yet sounded. She had finished in 5 minutes and 40 seconds. The silence that followed was not polite. It was not the silence of an audience waiting for an opportunity to speak. It was the heavier, stranger silence of a room full of beings who were, in various ways they would likely never fully explain, recalculating something. Then the 6-minute marker sounded, and the session moved on. George was waiting for her at the bottom of the access corridor. He handed her water and did not say anything immediately, which she appreciated. "Did it work?" she asked after a moment. He glanced at his tablet. "Thessenvor has sent a message." She took the tablet. The message was short. It read, "3 council members have pulled your full biological and historical archive in the last 4 minutes. That has not occurred for a new species in 400 years. Do not leave the station." Yara handed the tablet back. She drank her water. She looked at the ceiling. "The Vreth will challenge the address," she said. "Yes," George said. "Good," she said. "That means they're worried." The challenge came before the end of the day. The Vreth representative, she had learned its name by now, a designation that translated roughly as Senior Advocate Verathul, filed a formal objection to the content of Yara's address on grounds that it contained, in the legal language of the council, emotionally manipulative non-cognitive data. The claim was that she had not presented evidence of human cognitive contribution to galactic civilization, but had instead appealed to sentiment, which the Council framework classified as a procedurally invalid form of advocacy. It was, Yara noted privately, a clever move. It was also a move that revealed something important. They were not arguing that her content was wrong. They were arguing that it should not have been allowed to matter. She spent that night preparing a response with George, and with a council legal interpreter named Wren Calloway, a human woman from the Mara's diplomatic support team, who had spent the past 2 years studying Galactic Council procedural law with the focused intensity of someone who understood that in a room where you cannot rely on force or history or political alliance, the only power available is precision. They are arguing that emotional data is non-cognitive, Wren said, spreading documents across the desk. But the Council's own framework for cognitive assessment, last revised 260 years ago, includes emotional range and complexity as a Tier 2 cognitive indicator in species with individual consciousness structures. Yara looked at her, meaning emotion is, by the Council's own definition, a cognitive function. They are arguing that your evidence was non-cognitive by presenting it as emotional, but under their own classification system, emotional complexity is evidence of cognitive capacity. Wren looked up. They wrote the rule that defeats their own argument. Does Thessenvor know this? Yara asked. I believe, Wren said carefully, that Thessenvor may have been hoping we would find it ourselves. The procedural hearing convened the following morning in a smaller adjudication chamber, also accessible to Yara only through the sub-level platform, because the station's architectural commitment to her observer status was apparently absolute. The chamber was attended by 5 council adjudicators, the Vreth advocacy team, and a senior council figure who had not appeared in any of the previous proceedings. Ethan Prime. Yara had read about Ethan Prime in the briefing materials she had assembled before departure. The designation was as close as the translation systems could render a name that existed in a form of communication that did not use sound. Ethan Prime was a silicon lattice entity, which meant its consciousness was distributed through a crystalline physical structure rather than a biological neural network, and it was approximately 3,000 years old. It held a position on the council that had no precise human equivalent, somewhere between Chief Justice, historical memory, and institutional conscience. It had not attended a preliminary hearing in, according to the records, over 100 years. Yara stood on her platform and was careful not to let her expression change. Wren presented the counterargument with methodical clarity, citing the relevant frameworks, the definitions, the logical chain. The Vreth advocacy team responded. The adjudicators conferred in a form of communication that the translation systems rendered only partially. Then Ethan Prime spoke. Its voice, through the translation system, had a quality that reminded Yara of stone under great pressure, dense, slow, carrying weight that had nothing to do with volume. We will direct one question to the human representative, it said. The chamber went still. Yara straightened. Commander Voss, Ethan Prime said, why do your people make art about death? The question landed in Yara's mind and stayed there, turning. She looked up at the speaker source, though she knew the entity did not have eyes directed at her in any way she could locate. She understood immediately what was being asked, not why humans created records of death, not why they documented mortality as a biological fact. The question was about elegy, about grief expressed in crafted form, about the fact that when humans lost things, they built objects and wrote words and composed sounds not to solve the loss but to inhabit it, to give it shape, to carry it forward in a form that could be shared. No other species in the council had a significant artistic tradition centered on endings. She had learned that from Thessenvor, in a quiet conversation 3 nights ago. The silicon lattice beings did not die in any individual sense, their consciousness recognized as final. The energy-form civilizations experienced continuity in ways that made individual termination a partial concept at best. The biologicals who did die individually processed it as data, a termination event, a resource redistribution, a statistical certainty. Only humans wrote elegies. Only humans built graves and visited them. Only humans looked at the fact of ending and decided it needed to be made beautiful. She took a breath. Because we end, she said. Every single one of us. Not as a civilization, our civilization may continue for a very long time, and we hope it does. But each person, each individual life ends, and we know this from the time we are old enough to understand anything. She paused. You might think that knowledge would make us withdraw, that knowing an ending was coming would make us invest less, connect less, reach less. Some species, I imagine, would respond that way. She thought of her father. She had not planned to mention him. She mentioned him. My father died of a disease that our medical science cured 4 years after his death, she said. 4 years. He spent the last months of his life knowing that the cure existed, that it was being developed, that it would arrive too late for him specifically. He spent those months finishing a garden he had been working on for 20 years. He planted trees he knew he would not see fully grown. He wrote letters to people he loved, telling them things he had meant to say for years and had put off saying. She looked at the adjudication panel. The art we make about death is not about giving up, she said. It is about the opposite. It is the record of everything a person chose to do with the time they had, and everything the people who loved them chose to remember. We make it because we refuse to accept that what someone was simply stops mattering when they stop breathing. We make it because we believe the shape of a life is worth preserving, even when the life is gone. She let a moment pass. That belief, that things which have ended still matter, that the past is worth carrying, is the same belief that makes us launch ships toward stars we will never reach. It is the same belief that kept 41 crew members working for 69 days at the entrance of a collapsed mine. It is the same belief that put a golden record on a probe in 1977 and sent it into the dark without an address. The chamber was completely quiet. We make art about death, Yara said, because we are the species that decided the ending of a thing does not determine its value. And that decision, she paused, is why we are still here. The silence held for 11 seconds. She counted them. Then Ethan Prime said, "The hearing is recessed." George was waiting for her in the corridor. He had heard the entire proceeding through her communication feed. His expression, usually carefully composed, had something in it that she did not see there often. "That was not in any briefing document," he said quietly. "No," she said, "it was not." They walked back toward the observer section in silence. Halfway there, Wren caught up with them at a quick pace, tablet in hand. 5 council members have changed their vote since the hearing began, she said, slightly breathless. Thesson Vor just confirmed it. The reclassification motion does not have a majority. Yara stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the corridor of the Nexus Eternal, the largest constructed object she had ever stood inside, surrounded by the architecture of civilizations that had existed for millennia before her species had learned to write, and she took one long, slow breath. "And the challenge?" she asked. "Dismissed," Wren said. Ethan Prime issued the ruling before the recess ended. Emotional complexity under conditions of individual mortality is classified as a Tier 2 cognitive indicator. The address was valid. Yara nodded. She started walking again. Behind her, she heard George say, very quietly to no one in particular, 4 years too late. She did not turn around, but she heard it. The vote was not a triumph in any version of the word that would have satisfied the human appetite for drama. The reclassification motion failed by a margin that was not even close, once 5 votes shifted. Humanity was granted provisional recognized status, the lowest tier of formal acknowledgement, the first step on a long ladder that might take generations to climb, meaning exactly nothing in terms of political power or resource protection or any concrete benefit that could be written on a summary report. It was not a win. It was a door opening barely 1 inch. And yet, Yara sat in her bubble below the council floor that evening after the session ended, the chamber above her empty now, the lights dimmed to their overnight cycle. She sat alone because she had told George she needed an hour, and George was good enough at his job to know that an hour meant an hour. She looked out through the curved, transparent walls at the void of the station interior, at the distant structural lights moving in patterns she had stopped trying to interpret. She was not happy exactly. Happy was too simple a word for what was moving through her, and too light. She was something more complicated, something that felt like the specific sensation of having held a weight for a very long time and then, not having set it down, but having shifted her grip so that it no longer felt like it was pulling her apart. The work was not done. It had barely begun. Humanity had 41 people and 1 ship in a station the size of a moon, carrying provisional recognized status that could be revoked at the next session if they made the wrong move, in a political landscape they did not yet understand, surrounded by 17 civilizations with thousands of years of accumulated influence and agenda. They were the newest thing here by an enormous margin. They were also, she thought, remembering the 4 seconds of silence when the clerk called Saw Roman 3 and every eye in the chamber turned downward, no longer invisible. Thessenvor found her as she was preparing to return to the Mara for the night. He fell into step beside her without preamble, which she had come to recognize as his style. Ethan Prime has not called a recess during a hearing in over 100 years, he said. I know, she said, you mentioned that. I mentioned it to indicate surprise, he said. I am mentioning it again to indicate something else. Ethan Prime called a recess because it needed time to consider what you said. 3,000 years of existence and it needed time to consider what you said. He paused. I have been here for 200 years. I have watched species come and go from this chamber. I have watched them attempt to impress the council, to demonstrate power, to prove technological advancement, to present scientific achievement. He was quiet for a moment. None of them talked about their dead. Yara said nothing. It was not what was expected, Thessenvor said. That is not always a disadvantage. Was it ever a disadvantage for the Keth? She asked. Coming here with nothing but the hope that someone would find you worth knowing. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Yes, he said, for a long time, he paused, and then it was not. He stopped walking. She walked a few more steps, then stopped and turned. He inclined his head, the Keth farewell she had learned by now. The ISV Mara departs at 600, he said. I will be at the dock. She looked at him. You don't need to be. I know, he said, and he turned and walked away. The Mara left the Nexus Eternal at exactly 600, and Thessenvor was at the dock. He did not speak. He stood at the edge of the umbilical connection and watched the ship disengage, and Yara watched him through the bridge window until the distance made him impossible to distinguish from the structure around him. She turned back to the navigation display. 6 weeks to Earth. A long ride home through a universe that had just barely agreed to notice them. George brought coffee, real coffee. He sat down at the station beside hers and opened his report tablet and then closed it again immediately, which was so unlike him that she looked over. We should celebrate, he said, shouldn't we? Yara considered the question. We got a provisional designation that could be revoked at any time and grants us no actual protections, she said. We are a single ship with 41 people. The Vreth are going to try again at the next session. We have a lot of work ahead of us and very little leverage to do it with. George nodded slowly. Yes, he said, all of that. She looked at the forward viewport, the stars, the dark. Make the coffee better than usual, she said. He almost smiled. I'll see what I can do. She did not write a formal debrief that first day. She meant to. The recorder sat open on her desk in the cabin, and she sat across from it for 20 minutes and then closed it and picked up a pen and a piece of paper, actual paper, brought from Earth, one of 17 sheets in a small notebook that had belonged to her father, and she began to write. Not to the UN, not to the committee, not to anyone who would file it or classify it or enter it into any official record. She wrote to her father. She wrote about the station and the chamber and the bubble below the floor. She wrote about Thessenvor and Wren and George. She wrote about the infant on the floor and the miner and the pale blue dot. She wrote about standing on a platform in front of beings who had existed for millennia and talking about a garden and letters written to people who needed to hear things that had been put off too long. She wrote, "We were seen today, Dad. Not the way we wanted to be seen, not yet. But we were seen. They could not look away." She folded the letter. She did not have an address to send it to. She put it in the notebook anyway and put the notebook in the inner pocket of her jacket close. The days passed. 6 weeks of travel, and she filled them with work, analyzing every moment of the council sessions, building dossiers on every member species, writing frameworks for the next engagement, running simulations with Wren on procedural scenarios, learning what she could from the audio and visual records she had made. She slept 6 hours a night, no more, no less, because she had learned a long time ago that the body was a resource and needed to be managed like one. On the 23rd day, a message arrived from Earth, not from the government, which had been sending careful, formal inquiries through official channels, from the public. Someone had leaked, inevitably, in the way that things always inevitably leaked when 400 people knew them. It had gotten out. Not everything, not the details, but enough humanity had been to the council, humanity had been heard, humanity had been given a designation. The messages that came through were overwhelming. Yara read them for 4 hours straight and then had to stop. There were people who were angry, convinced it was a trap or a mistake. There were people who were afraid, who had not previously allowed themselves to think about what it meant that there were 17 other civilizations out there, and they were all considerably older and more established than humanity. There were people asking practical questions about what provisional recognized status meant for trade or for safety. There were scientists listing what they needed to know. There were children, actual children, based on the writing, asking questions that cut directly to the things adults were too composed to ask out loud. One message from a woman in New Zealand named Dorothy Lane said only, "My daughter is 7 years old. She wants to know if any of them were nice." Yara wrote back. She wrote some of them were. She did not know if Dorothy Lane ever received the reply. The communication delay made conversations across that distance feel like notes passed in a very slow, very important game of patience. On the 38th day, Penny Hartley knocked on the cabin door and said, without any preamble, "We're getting a signal." Yara was at her desk instantly, from the Nexus Eternal, Penny said. It was a short message, formal in structure, which meant it had come through the council's administrative system. When Wren finished decoding it, she stood very still for a moment before she brought it to Yara. It was addressed not to the Isfmara. It was addressed to the provisional representative of Sol Roman III. "It's an invitation to the next session," Wren said, "in 14 months. Yara looked at the message for a long time. The Vreth would be at that session. They would try again, and they would try better, because they were not a species that repeated a failure in the same form twice. The other council members would have had 14 months to consider their positions, and some would reconsider, and some would be less willing to extend the quiet support they had offered this time. The work ahead was harder than the work behind, and the work behind had been the most difficult thing Yara had ever done. She thought about the infant on the floor, falling, standing, falling, standing. She thought about a ship still moving through the dark, past the edge of the solar system now, past any boundary that could meaningfully be called home, carrying a golden record addressed to no one and everyone. She thought about a garden planted full of trees the planter would never see grow. "Confirm attendance," she said. Ren typed the response. The HFY's navigation system made the adjustment 2 days later as they crossed into the inner solar system. A small correction. A new destination added to the return list, 14 months away. The crew received the news without much ceremony, because they were professionals and they had already understood, most of them, that this was not a mission with an end point. This was the beginning of something without a clear shape yet, something that would outlast all of them individually and would require generations of Yaras and Georges and Wrens to make into anything recognizable. On the last day of the journey, Yara sat on the bridge as the sun grew in the viewport. It looked ordinary from here. A yellow star, medium-sized, nothing remarkable about it in any cosmic catalog. The kind of star that 14-year-old aspiring astronomers sometimes passed over in favor of more dramatic candidates. But there, orbiting it at the third position, barely visible from this distance, a small blue dot. She pressed one hand flat against the glass. She held it there. They were not a great civilization yet. She knew that fully and without self-deception. They were not the oldest thing out there, not the most powerful, not the most advanced, not the most anything. They were young in the way that made the older civilizations weary just to look at, full of the specific energy of a species that had not yet learned how much was impossible. They were the thing that kept getting up. And apparently, out here, in the silence between stars, in the chambers where the long-established powers made their arrangements and drew their lines, that was the rarest thing of all. The HFY entered Earth orbit at 14:33 on a Thursday afternoon, local time, and the communications system lit up with more messages than it had ever received at once. Yara let them cue. She would read everyone, she always did. She was still looking at the pale blue dot when George appeared at her shoulder. "Welcome home, Commander," he said. She kept her hand on the glass. "Not yet," she said. "One more look." She looked for a long time. Then she turned, picked up her case and went to work.